and to the Congress.
But how are they violating federal law?
Because they are impeding the enforcement.
How are
of
they
that.
doing that?
Oh, with these protests. That, for example,
wait, are you talking about the state, or are you talking about individuals who are?
No, I'm talking about the state. I'm talking about the state because Minnesota, like Connecticut, like New York, like several others,
that could have potentially been worked out from the beginning if there had been an attempt to, and it also rolls back the most aggressive forms of ICE enforcement, the roving patrols, potentially. All right, we'll see what happens. The roving patrols, the stop and show me your papers, the going after people, you know, as they're dropping off their kids at school.
It's worth prioritizing going after not just people who are here illegally, but people who are here illegally and have committed other crimes. And if there's agreement and consent on that between the state and the feds, good. That's a good thing.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're here, you already know what we do. We don't play dumb, we don't take sides, we don't let power rewrite reality in real time. Before we get into it, take 1 second, hit subscribe, not because you agree with everything, but because this channel breaks down what's actually happening when the talking point starts collapsing. Now here's a hook and pay attention. When a government tells you it's drawing down while promising to stay forever, when officials say they are de-escalating while also declaring immunity, when the tone suddenly softens only after the public backlash, that's not clarity, that's damage control. Because what you're watching right now isn't a policy shift, it's a credibility crisis. Let's break down exactly what they said and what they accidentally admitted.
In Minnesota. So here are the major headlines. Tom Homan has now ordered federal authorities to work on an eventual drawdown plan in the state. So what does that look like? Well, Homan says it'll mean more targeted operations and that agents are going to focus on working in jails and prisons and less on the street. Now, for weeks, the Trump administration has been grappling with intense backlash following 2 deadly ICE shootings in Minneapolis. The new plan marks a significant change in its approach to immigration enforcement and in tone.
We will remain in Minneapolis forever.
When the violence decreases, we can draw down those resources.
This appears as an attempt to kill or to cause bodily harm to agents, an act of domestic terrorism.
As a career law enforcement officer, we'll let the investigation roll out.
The suspect put himself in that situation.
I don't want to see anybody die, even the people we're looking for.
Governor Walz and Mayor Frey, they instead choose violence.
Bottom line is you can't fix problems if you don't have discussions.
Our officer followed his training, did exactly what he's been taught to do.
Nothing's ever perfect, and anything can be improved on.
To all ICE officers, you have federal immunity in the conduct of your duties.
They're trying to do it with professionalism. If they don't, they'll be dealt with.
Gas on Bill! Gas on Bill!
I didn't come to Minnesota for photo ops or headlines.
Jose Antonio Vargas joins us. He's the author of Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen.
Here's what makes this moment fascinating, not emotional, not moral, strategic. Watch how the language suddenly changes. For weeks, the tone was absolute. Hard lines, hard certainty, no ambiguity. Now we are hearing words like drawdown, targeted, recalibration, discussion. That shift doesn't happen by accident, because on one hand you have got officials saying, we are not going anywhere, we will remain here forever. And on the other hand, in the same breath, when things cool down, we'll pull back. When violence decreases, resources change. Both can be true at the same time, but they are being said anyway. And that's the tell. What you're watching isn't policy, it's positioning. Notice how responsibility floats, it never lands. Sometimes it's a situation, sometimes it's a suspect, sometimes it's training or bad actors. But never a fixed point, never a single anchor. That's intentional. Because anchoring means accountability and ambiguity buys time. Then there's the tone whiplash. One official says this is domestic terrorism, another says let the investigation play out. One voice insists they followed their training exactly, another quietly adds nothing perfect, everything can improve. Those statements aren't clarification, they are contradictions. Carefully layered to speak to different audiences at the same time. And that's the game. Strong enough language to reassure one crowd, soft enough language to calm other, vague enough that no one can pin it down later. And here's the most interesting part. Listen closely. They are now emphasizing jails and prisons. They're now emphasizing less street presence. They are now emphasizing targeted operations, which raises a question they never say out loud. If this was always the preferred approach, why wasn't it the approach from the start? They don't answer that. They glide past it. Instead, they sell the pivot as evolution, learning, adjustment, professionalism, not reversal, not consequence. And that's the art of it. Because the message isn't really about enforcement anymore, it's about topics, stability, control. About convincing everyone that you're seeing now was always the plan, even if it clearly wasn't. No admission, no apology, just a reset wrapped in authority. That's how power survives pressure, not by admitting error, but by redefining the moment. What matters is this: when the language changes this fast, it's because the room changed and the people speaking about it.
It's amazing, by the way. If you're not reading the Minneapolis Star Tribune, please read it, contribute, because the local reporting happening on the ground.
Work,
My friend Steve Grove is now the CEO there, and they've done an incredible job really making sure that we're seeing what's happening community by community, neighbor by neighbor. But I have to say, what does it look like? To me, look, what President Trump is good at is looking at the optics. You know, it would be an amazing optic. Can we actually find a solution to immigration rather than keeping throwing, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars trying to do what we're doing that doesn't make any sense? Poll after poll has now shown that the majority of the public doesn't agree with what ICE is doing. What does the solution actually look like?
And I'll just say, look, Tom Homan is no immigration softie. He is a hardliner, okay, people? This is not somebody who is like trying to do something different from the objective that Trump wants. But Elie, it strikes me what he laid out today is common sense. It's something that could have potentially been worked out from the beginning if there had been an attempt to. And it also rolls back the most aggressive forms of ICE enforcement, the roving patrols, potentially, all right, we'll see what happens. The roving patrols, the stop and show me your papers, the going after people, you know, as they're dropping off their kids at school, those are the things that raised constitutional questions, that raised morality questions, frankly.
Today was a good day. I'm not saying it's over. I'm not saying it's solved. I'm not saying we're in the clear, but whichever side of this you're on, this was a good day. This was a good step by Tom Homan. And to your point, Jose, and I've been saying on this show, Abby, not everything has a legal lawsuit-based solution.
Now, this is where the tone in the room really shifts. You go from local reporting and community reaction straight into a strategic game of optics and big picture framing. And if there's one thing political operatives understand better than most, it's optics. What looks good on camera, what doesn't, what makes your base feel confident, and what makes the opposition sweat. And right now, there's a new narrative emerging. People on the panel start talking in a way that feels different. Less sound bites, more long game framing. They don't just talk about the enforcement, they talk about solutions, efficiency, targeted operations. Words that don't inflame but don't concede either. One voice even calls this is a good day, not a victory, not a resolution, but a positive step in the complex process. That's a classic political pivot. Watch how it works. First, the issue is cast as one of freedom and constitutional concern, not just local fallout, but a national question about how policy plays out in communities. Then the narrative broadens. Instead of proving a point, the conversation shifts to whether the public agrees with what's happened. Polls, public sentiment, majority opinion. Suddenly the focus is on how this feels to everyday Americans, and that matters. Because in politics, perception often then comes the strategic reassessment. Tom Homan, traditionally seen as a headliner, gets reframed not as a firebrand, but as someone who is not advocating common sense judgments. That's not about backing down, that's about reframing. The panel dials back the aggressive imagery, roving patrols, street stops. Those charged phrases start to get pushed aside in favor of more palatable terms. Refocusing efforts, less on street, more where it matters. This is a messaging movement. No one is saying the problem is solved. No one is declaring triumph. But you hear language about steps, adjustments, pragmatism, and the possibility of improvement. That's political talk. Start with conflict, move to common ground language, then plant seeds of a new consensus. It's a classic move from confrontation to cooperation language without conceding the core objective. It sounds like everyone is repositioning, and in politics, that's the moment when the thing starts to change, not end.
Things are on the borderline of constitutionality or over the line of being unconstitutional. What I think everyone can agree on, right? Even if you're, what you do, Jose, Scott, where you're coming from, is that it's worth prioritizing going after not just people who are here illegally, but people who are here illegally and have committed other crimes. And if there's agreement and consent on that between the state and the feds, good. That's a good thing.
Well, I like the fact that you're invoking the United States Constitution because it clearly says that immigration law is a federal issue and that individual states, whether it's Minnesota or any other state, cannot simply say, we're not part of the United States, we're not going to follow this law. All throughout American history, states have tried that, starting with 1798, and again, the Supreme Court has said, no, an individual state can't decide they're not going to abide by federal law. Florida can't decide its residents aren't going to pay income taxes anymore.
Where are you getting that Minnesota is not abiding by federal law?
Because they're not abiding by federal law because the federal law says that immigration is a policy that belongs to the president and to the Congress.
But how are they violating federal law?
Because they are impeding the enforcement.
How are they doing that?
Oh, with these protests. That, for example,
wait, are you talking about the state or are you talking about individuals who are going out?
No, I'm talking about the state. I'm talking about the state because Minnesota, like Connecticut, like New York, like several others, have done everything they can to impede their law enforcement, not just from assisting, but even cooperating. For example, there's
nothing in federal law that says that local law enforcement has to cooperate with.
Well, yes, because right now,
let me finish it.
But ICE has warrants for 270 people in Minnesota jails, and Minnesota refused to hand them over. That is a violation of federal law.
This is where the conversation stops pretending to be calm. Because now it's not about tactics, it's about optics, it's about power, who has it, who doesn't, and who gets to decide how the rules are enforced. You can hear it in the way the tone sharpens. One side tries to land on a phrase everyone can nod along to, borderline constitutional common ground. That's the language of compromise. It sounds reasonable, it sounds safe. But then the counterpunch comes, and it's not subtle. Suddenly the Constitution gets pulled out like a weapon, not as a guide, not as a framework. The argument shifts from what should be done to who is allowed to decide. Federal authority versus state resistance, central power versus local discretion. And here's what makes this movement crackle. The claim isn't just that the enforcement is difficult, it's that non-cooperation itself is defiance. That's a big escalation, because once you frame disagreement as obstruction, you're no longer debating policy. And Abby Phillip does what she always does in this moment. She slows it down. She doesn't accept slogans. She doesn't accept broad accusations. She keeps asking the most dangerous questions in cable news. How? Not why, not what do you believe, but how specifically is the law being violated? That's when the conversation starts to wobble, because broad claims sound strong until you are asked to back them up in real time. The tension you feel isn't ideological, it's procedural. It's the discomfort of having to move from rhetoric to receipts, and notice how fast the focus shifts from state governments to protest, to law enforcement to cooperation, to numbers. The argument keeps sliding, trying to find solid ground. That tells you everything. This isn't a clean debate, it's a collision of narratives. One side is arguing principle, who controls immigration law, the other is arguing process, what cooperation actually requires. And neither side wants to concede the frame, because the frame decides who looks reasonable and who looks reckless. This is the moment where viewers stop hearing policy and start hearing power struggle. Now, left versus right, not pro or anti, but who gets to say this is the law and who has to obey. And that tension that doesn't resolve on a panel, that's the kind of tension that spills into quotes and headlines, and everyone at that table knows it.
To turn over information to the feds. If you're doing this in the real world, the way to do it efficiently and effectively is cooperatively, and this was a step towards that.
But how is it progress, though, if there can't be progress without justice? So where's the justice when we don't even know or have the names of the officers who potentially...
Yes. Look, that's a separate question, I agree.
Yeah, but so, look, was it a step? I guess, if you want to read it that way. To me, a real step is we need to know who the officers were, and we need to know what kind of disciplinary action and or criminal action they will face for the death of Alex Preddy. Until we know that, then to me, all of this talk about how they're going to change doesn't matter. Because honestly, hearing him talk about what the directives were and how they're changing The original directives were wrong. They should have never been in place anyway. This level of aggressiveness on these people, and I hope that Americans, not just those in Minneapolis, and you alluded to this, I hope everybody everywhere, because sometimes with this barrage and constant chaos that we are confronted with, people feel overwhelmed, they feel hopeless, and I hope this is an indication and a signal to them that your voice still matters, because there's so much happening in our news cycle where people don't feel that way.
Let me just play, this is from Caitlin Dickerson. She's one of the foremost experts in how federal immigration works. This is how she's talking about what ICE enforcement used to look like. Listen.
What ICE agents did historically is that they would identify someone they wanted to arrest, do lots of work at a desk on a computer before they ever pursued this person to confirm their identity, to confirm they had no claim to legal status in the United States. Once that work was done, they would often go to the person's house at 5 or 6 in the morning, knock on the door, and try to take them into custody, often while other relatives are still sleeping and before they leave for work for the day.
And that was done, she points out, not just to minimize the impact, the community impact, but also to protect the officers from these high visibility operations that actually can also put them in danger. And I think what Tom Homan is saying...
This is where the word progress gets put on trial, because someone says cooperation is working, that this is a step forward, that this is how things get done in the real world. And immediately that framing gets challenged, not politely, not academically, but fundamentally. The pushback isn't about tactics anymore, it's about justice versus optics. You hear it in the interruption, progress without accountability isn't progress, it's just motion. There's a core tension here. One side is willing to call any change a win, the other side refuses to call anything a win. Until names are named, responsibilities assigned, and consequences are clear. And that clash matters because it exposes two totally different definitions of success. For one side, success is adjustment, dialing things back, lowering the temperature. For the other, success doesn't even begin until the people involved are identified. And there's clarity about what happens next. And notice what happens next in the conversation. The tone shifts from debate to fatigue. You hear it when Hill talks about people feeling overwhelmed, burned out, numb from the constant churn. That's not policy talk, that's emotional reality, that this is the moment where the panel stops talking at the audience and starts talking about them. About people watching who feel like nothing they say matters anymore, like outrage is pointless, like chaos just rolls on no matter what, and then Philip does something very deliberate. She widens the lens, she brings in historical context, not as a verdict, but as context. Here's how it used to look: slower, quieter, less theatrical, not framed as morality, not framed as ideology, but framed as process. Desk work first, verification first, not to appease communities, not to soften enforcement, but to reduce risk for everyone involved. That comparison lands hard, because suddenly the question isn't aren't things changing now, it's why were they ever done differently? And that's what makes this segment crackle. No one is shouting, no one is name calling, but the implication hangs in the air. If quieter method existed, if less explosive method existed, then the real debate isn't left versus right, it's choice. Who choose escalation? Who tolerated it? That's the tension the audience feels, even if no one says it outright. And once that tension is exposed, there's no going back to simple talking points.
This agreement that he has, apparently with the Attorney General Ellison, about working, to Elie's point, with the county jails, that's one of the things the White House has been asking for, is some cooperation at the jails. This is clearly a step in the right direction. Now, as you pointed out, Abby, he's still very much an immigration hardliner, and even though they are going to prioritize people who have other criminal issues, he said if you're in the country illegally, you're never off the table. And so he was also still signaling to the president's supporters that, listen, we're not backing down on the president's priorities on illegal immigration. He also said today that he was very much aware of these organizations that are going on, these signal groups, these WhatsApp groups that are trying to organize the impeding of federal law enforcement. And he said he was very much looking into that. He was clearly very aware of that. I think that was good news. Look, overall, I agree with Elie. This was clearly a good, if you believe that having less chaos and more efficiency in government and more cooperation is good, today was clearly a great day.
I was going to ask you that, because I feel like the last few weeks you've been defending some of the more aggressive tactics. Do you feel now that they were a mistake?
I don't feel sending
federal law enforcement to enforce federal law was a mistake.
I'm talking about the tactics, how it's being done, not whether or not they are detaining people, but how they're doing it. The random stops, the roving patrols, the middle of the day knocking down of people's doors, maybe without a judicial warrant, especially in that one case where they actually were very wrong about who lived in that house. So do you feel like sitting here now, given that Homan is seeming to pull some of that back, that it was a mistake to go that far?
Well, I agree with what Homan said about that today. Nothing's perfect and everything can be improved. And if you look at the totality of it, they did arrest a great number of very, very bad people. They did get a lot of very, very violent, terrible people out of the community. And we've also seen a situation in Minneapolis that nobody wants to see. And if Tom Homan, who I trust a lot, says things can be improved and things can be better, I trust his word. So I think that's a good thing.
We're going to pause here. We have much more ahead when we come back from this quick break.
This is where the conversation quietly shifts, not in slogans, not in outrage, but in admission. Because for the first time in weeks, you're hearing something close to consensus, even if nobody wants to say that word out loud. There's an agreement now, not an ideology, not on immigration as a whole, but on how things are done. Working through county jails, reducing chaos, less randomness, more coordination. That's not a retreat, that's recalibration. And you can hear the balancing act happening in real time. On one hand, the message to supporters is clear. No one is off the table. No priorities are being abandoned. On the other hand, the tone has changed. The posture has changed. The temperature has dropped. And Philip puts her finger right on the pressure point. Not was enforcement wrong, but were the tactics a mistake. That distinction matters because enforcement is abstract, tactics are lived. Random stops, midday raids, those are the moments that break trust, even among people who support enforcement in principle. And notice the answer. It's not a reversal, it's not a confession, it's something more revealing. Nothing's perfect, everything can be improved. That's not ideological surrender, that's damage control language. It acknowledges success and fallout, removals and consequences. Not left versus right, not open borders, but whether a system can enforce power without losing legitimacy in the process, because once legitimacy erodes, everything becomes harder. Not because it ends the debate, but because it shows the debate has finally moved past slogan and into consequences. If you want the version of politics that isn't screaming, isn't scripted, and isn't pretending these conversations are simple, you're in the right place. This channel breakdowns how power actually talks, how narratives shift, and where the cracks start to show. Subscribe if you want clarity without the spin, because the loudest voices aren't always the most honest, and we don't miss what matters here. See you in the next one.